1945 to 1953, something like 600 million people came under communist rule. It was an existential threat to the United States. So what do you do about that? Well, Eisenhower essentially bluffed. He said to the Soviets, we will meet you at time and place of our own determination with means of our own determination, and that meant nuclear weapons. And that was a pretty big bluff.
Welcome to the Forum from the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. I'm Doug Blackman. We're joined today by Evan Thomas, a journalist, teacher, and historian, the author of many widely read books, including The War Lovers, biographies of John Paul Jones and Robert Kennedy, and his history of the Pacific conflict during World War II, Sea of Thunder. Thomas was a longtime writer and editor at Newsweek magazine and editor-at-large in his final years there. In addition to his writing, through which I believe he is next examining Richard Nixon, I hope that's not letting out a secret of any particular significance, Thomas also teaches writing and journalism at Princeton University. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with a softball question, and that is the title of your book. What exactly, when I first saw that title, I was expecting a book about some particular bluff, a bet made by Eisenhower, some move that I was unaware of from history in which he won a particular episode with the Soviets or something like that. But that's not at all what your book is about. Ike's Bluff is something quite different. What is Ike's Bluff?
Well, Eisenhower was a great warrior, obviously, helped win World War II. But he was, as president, somebody who was able to keep the peace. During his presidency, after he got us out of Korea, which took about 3 months, never committed combat troops again. No other modern president can say that. And so I got curious about this. How did he do this? Because he wasn't a pacifist. He was a warrior. But he had a central insight learned from reading. He was actually although people thought he was kind of a dope, a lot of people, he was an intellectual, closet intellectual, deeply read. And one of the people he read was von Clausewitz on war. And one of the messages that Eisenhower took from Clausewitz is that little wars have a way of becoming big wars. And that politicians and statesmen who think they can control war are kidding themselves. This was a central, important insight for Eisenhower, and he was determined not to get us into any war. But 1953, you look at a map, communism is on the march. From 1945 to 1953, something like 600 million people came under communist rule of one kind or another. Eastern Europe, Asia. It was an existential threat to the United States. So we couldn't just come home from World War II and forget about it. So what do you do about that? If you don't want to get into little wars, and he certainly didn't want to fight the big war, a nuclear war, what do you do? Well, Eisenhower essentially bluffed. He said to the Soviets, if you try to advance, we will meet you at time and place of our own determination, with means of our own determination, and that meant nuclear weapons. And that was a pretty big bluff because nobody ever really knew whether he intended to use those weapons or not. But he was a credible threat. If you've been Supreme Allied Commander in World War II, you have a kind of credibility when you make these threats. And he had a long, complicated dance with the Soviets, and it showed itself in also the Red Chinese and crises in Vietnam and Red China over the Quemoy and Matsu, names that are long forgotten now, Berlin, Suez Crisis, where there was a real risk of war, and Eisenhower basically bluffed with nuclear weapons. And it worked. It was a close thing. We had some scary times then, but it basically worked. And that, in the largest sense, was Ike's bluff. I will say, at a personal level, he was a great poker player. He learned how to play poker at West Point. And he was so good at it that he had to quit, because he was taking away so much money from his fellow officers that it was hurting his career. But he switched to bridge, was pretty formidable at that, and although he's a very cautious, conservative man in a lot of ways, he had a kind of a big picture, strategic vision of how to pull off the big bluff. That was it.
But so, could the book also have been entitled Ike's Threat as much? I mean, and by that I mean in the sense that he sat atop such military supremacy in the world at that time, was it really a bluff, or was it essentially that he had access to a kind of destructive power that no one else arguably in the world did, at least for a part of this time?
He did, but we had massive superiority, but it wasn't going to last. When Eisenhower's first day in office, he goes to the Oval Office and his desk drawer is locked. And he asks for a key, and inside there's a report there, a secret report left for him by President Truman, a report written by J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was the father of the atom bomb. And in the report it says, the United States and the Soviet Union will soon achieve what they called nuclear plenty, kind of a chilling Cold War term, and that within a fairly short period of time, each side will be able to put as many as 2,500 atom bombs on the other. And the United States and the Soviet Union, as Oppenheimer wrote, will become like two scorpions in a bottle, waiting to sting each other to death. That was a pretty scary thought. And indeed, that summer of 1953, Eisenhower and his National Security Council contemplated a preemptive strike on the Soviet Union. The idea was to hit them before they could hit us. Now, obviously, they didn't do that. But it showed you how seriously they took the threat, that they even thought of such a thing. It was a while before the Soviets had the capacity to really do us terrible harm. But, you know, it only takes a couple of nuclear bombs. It doesn't take much. And the Soviets did have, by 1953, they had a stockpile of at least 50 atom bombs. They had some long-range bombers. It would have been crazy for them to do it. But we didn't really know our enemy that well. We didn't really know how crazy they were. Stalin was not a guy that you wanted to mess with. And when Stalin died, we didn't even know who was in charge of the Soviet Union.
Do you think that Eisenhower was serious about the I mean, do you think he would have gone through with his bluff under certain circumstances? Or what circumstances would he have done that?
Well, one of the things that fascinated me about him is that we don't really know. He had an aide named Andy Goodpaster, General Goodpaster, who was his staff secretary, but really his aide on the scary stuff, on the national security stuff, the secret stuff. And Goodpaster, after Ike died, said that he never knew himself whether Eisenhower would have used those weapons or not. Now, he thought he wouldn't have. He guessed that he wouldn't have. But Eisenhower never told him. Now, think about this. Think about this. Eisenhower didn't even tell his closest aide whether he would have used those weapons. If you think about it, he couldn't. He couldn't, because once you start talking about it, the deterrence doesn't really, it's not real anymore. Washington is a city with no secrets. Even if you tell your closest aide one way or the other, it's going to get out. And so Eisenhower held this secret to himself. My personal guess is that after, say, 1955, he would not have, because the consequences were too great. Maybe in 53, 54, he might have used, if the peace treaty had broken down in Korea, he might have used them. But I don't know, and that's the point. I don't know, because he wasn't going to tell anybody, because once he did, there goes the deterrent effect.
And what did the Soviets think at the time?
The Soviets were scared to death. They assumed in their doctrine that war between capitalism and communism was inevitable. And they were fearful that if they didn't build these weapons, we'd just take them out. There was a paranoia on both sides. It meant that both sides exaggerated the threat. And on our side, we exaggerated the Soviet threat. Remember the missile gap and the bomber gap? They were phony. Eisenhower knew that or sensed that. But there were a lot of forces that caused us to exaggerate them. Commercial forces, the military-industrial complex is a term that Eisenhower coined in 1960, but he operated all through his presidency on the basis that industrialists and the military would join forces and hype the Soviet threat to build more weapons. Eisenhower spent much of his presidency actually trying to contain the military. Little known fact, Eisenhower cut defense spending in his 8 years. Height of the Cold War, he cut defense spending. How did he do it? By cutting the hell out of the Army. He cut it by a third. Why? Because he didn't plan on using it. He wasn't going to fight any conventional wars. we did build up nuclear forces, rocket forces. We probably built them up too much. We went from about 1,000 nuclear weapons when he came in to 18,000 when he left. Those stockpiles got too big. When President Kennedy was given a briefing on what they called the single integrated operating plan, which was basically our plan to make the rubble bounce in the Soviet Union and China. The young President Kennedy turned to his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, and he said, and they call us human beings because the destructive capacity was so great.
You also write about, at one point in the book, Eisenhower making a notation in his diary after a particular terrible week in Korea, in which I think he ends the notation with "man is stupid," a similar sort of, which gets to another thing I wanted to ask you about, that you write at some length in places in the book about the degree to which that Eisenhower was affected by the scenes of civilian casualties and civilian death in World War II and the human losses in Korea. How did all of that play into the psyche of this great warrior?
Profoundly. I mean, Eisenhower was interestingly, never seen combat. The great warrior had never seen combat. In World War I, he was stateside training troops. By the time, to his great chagrin, by the time World War II came along, he was way too valuable and knew too much to ever be on the front lines. But he saw a lot of battlefields. He would go there in fresh battlefields. And he was always cleaning up after the detritus of war, the deserters, the rapists. I mean, the American Army was a disciplined army, as armies go, but war is a debasing and degrading thing. And Eisenhower, I was struck once, Eisenhower said in 1944, so many American soldiers were accused of rape that he said we should just line them up and machine gun them. Now, he didn't mean that, but it showed you the degree to which he's seeing the ugly side of war. In 1945, when the war was over, he flew in a small plane from Berlin to Moscow, over the path taken first by the German army going out, and then the Russian army coming back. As he flew low over this landscape, he did not see a single building left standing. That was the power of war. He went to the concentration camps. He went with General Patton, tough-talking Patton. When they got to Buchenwald, Patton threw up. And Eisenhower had to order the mayor of the town around the concentration camp to clean up the dead bodies. And the mayor hung himself that night with his wife. And Eisenhower wrote in his diary that he was glad because at least the conscience of the German people had not vanished altogether. I mean, that's the grimness that Eisenhower saw. He's not like one of these guys who studied war in college or thought about war. You know, there's a cruel epithet, chicken hawk, which applies to politicians who've never seen war and love war. Eisenhower had seen war, and he did not love it.
Did people realize at the time the level of effect that this had had on him? I mean, I assume that would have undercut the threat or the bluff that he was ready to pull the trigger again if there had been a full comprehension of the degree to which he was troubled by this and by the firebombing of Dresden. And
he never talked about that. I mean, you won't catch him talking about it. Would, in general terms, war as hell, but not with any specificity, because I think he was not. He was a 19th century figure in some ways. He did not bare his soul. You read his memoirs, you won't learn a damn thing. He was good at hiding the ball, you know, and he fooled a lot of people for a long time. Most people, I'm sure many of you, thought he was kind of a caretaker, genial, grandfatherly type, played a lot of golf. He did play a lot of golf, 800 times as president. That's a lot of golf. 200 times in Augusta. But he was a much more complicated guy. Historians have known this for 30 years ago. Fred Greenstein of Princeton wrote a book called The Hidden Hand, Hidden Hand Presidency, about Eisenhower. So the scholars have known this for a long time. But the general public didn't know it because Eisenhower didn't want them to know it. Eisenhower had this, and this is one thing I loved about him. He had a kind of confidence that was so profound that it allowed him to be humble. He didn't need to be the smartest guy in the room. In fact, he would play dumb. There are famous stories about this. once before a press conference in 1955. Press conference was about Red China, and it was going to be tense, and there were going to be difficult questions. And his aide said, "Oh, Mr. President, you have to be careful." And Eisenhower said, "Oh, don't worry, I'll just confuse them." And he did. He spoke in gibberish. Now imagine having that kind of confidence, to not care how smart you look and be intentionally kind of a dope. But it was effective. Eisenhower once said he got ahead by disguising his ambition and his intelligence. And he did. It was a very effective tool for him to be underestimated.
But you also say he was vain at times and very concerned about appearance in other respects.
He was human. He was very careful not to wear a helmet, to be photographed with a helmet. He never wanted to show off and pretend that he was a combat leader, because he wasn't. He was a behind-the-scenes guy. He wore his regular uniform. But he did get a special jacket made, the Eisenhower jacket, which made him look pretty good. I said to his, sort of half-jokingly to his son and to his granddaughter, John and Susan, is that because President Eisenhower or General Eisenhower knew that he had a good butt? And they said, "Yep." He was proud of his physique.
If only Michael Dukakis had been as wise about wearing helmets, history might have been changed. Talk a little more about how to square the idea of Eisenhower at the end, in his farewell address, warning about the military-industrial complex. How exactly do we square that with this massive growth in the nuclear stockpile, this tremendous growth in the industrial complex, even as the number of soldiers is going down? Do those
it's
really
a good
square?
question. It's a fair question, and it troubled me. I struggled with this. Eisenhower was not an aggressive interventionist in his own bureaucracy. And Admiral Strauss, who was the head of the AEC, was a very charming, powerful guy. And he had some sway over Eisenhower, and Eisenhower would raise questions about our nuclear arsenal, but he did not actively intervene to limit it. And I was once talking to the number 2 guy at the AEC, who's still alive, and he said, every year they get a call from the Pentagon, and the Pentagon would say, "What's your maximum capacity for producing nuclear weapons this year?" And he would tell them that would become the minimum requirement of the Pentagon. This is how bureaucracies work. And so they built too many of them. That's true. And when Eisenhower was briefed on this PSYOP that I mentioned, the Single Integrated Operating Plan, which is something that happened at Eisenhower's insistence, one plan for war. Eisenhower was shocked to find out how many weapons we had targeted at the Soviet Union, and he sent his science advisor out there to look into it, but by then it was too late. That was November 1960. So Eisenhower himself had some regrets about how big this arsenal had grown. The underlying thing was he wanted our threat to be so formidable that the Soviets wouldn't even think about it. And he believed you should have strong dogs pulling at the leash, and the strong dog in this case was Curtis LeMay, who was head of the Strategic Air Command, and he did all the targeting. And LeMay was a very aggressive guy, and Eisenhower kept him on a leash, and certainly in terms of using these weapons. But we built too many weapons, that's true.
And would it be a fair criticism or observation to say that Eisenhower obviously was, as you portray him, was not just bluffing to the Soviets or bluffing to the world, he was bluffing internally as well. He played this bluff out at all levels, and he was just intensely private, secretive about many things. And so his own people, to some degree, didn't know if it was a bluff. And one could say that in doing that, he essentially was encouraging LeMay and these others to order every bomb and missile they could. And then at the end, he distances himself from it by sort of suggesting that somehow somebody else must have been responsible for this.
I think that's a fair question. I think there was too much secrecy even in his own, partly because of this bluff, because he could never say whether he was going to use the things. He would say, he wanted overwhelming force, and his lieutenants would take that message and run with it a little bit too far. It's hard to calibrate these things, and I don't know what the proper force was, but I think 18,000 nuclear weapons in 1960 was more than we needed. Now, there was a lot of experimentation going on in the early days of the Cold War. We were building anti-missile missiles that had nuclear bombs on the end of them to blow up and stop incoming Russian bombers. So these Nike technology that we don't obviously use today. But we were experimenting with a lot of crazy stuff because we were in an arms race, and it was hard to know. And Eisenhower's own experience as a military guy was if you're fighting the last war, you're in trouble. He had a great appreciation for scientists. Under his watch, they created DARPA, which created the internet, the research agency at the Pentagon, the ICBM. We needed to be moving forward with these weapons and inventing new weapons. And I mean, it's so interesting to think about the side effects. You know, we think of electronics, about how miniaturization, you know, we make these tiny little watches and iPads and all that. Where did that miniaturization get its start? It got its start because we wanted to put a nuclear weapon on the end of a missile, and we had to make it small enough to do it. And the transistor, all of that huge expenditure of government resources, university resources, a lot of it was aimed at miniaturizing nuclear weapons so that we could put them on the end of rockets. Now, we've been the beneficiaries of this, especially since we never used those missiles. But, you know, you never know where science is going to go. It goes in beneficent ways and it goes in harmful ways. But Eisenhower was very committed to keeping those scientific wheels turning, and he did.
Somewhat like you, I'm a journalist turned more historian now, so I get to ask about this. But sometimes classic historians, academic historians, get irritated with guys like you, partly because your books sell a lot of copies, oftentimes, and theirs don't always. But in terms of the reaction to your book, to this book, from more conventional Cold War historians, there's been, I think, reasonably positive response, but also some quibbling with you over that perhaps that you may have fallen too much in love with Eisenhower in the course of writing this book, and minimized some of the places where other scholars have been more critical of him. Nonetheless, it's a very historically grounded book. You got tons of footnotes, a beautiful bibliography. I mean, it's clearly a deeply researched book. But what's your reaction both to the reaction that there's been, but also I would just be interested to hear you talk about that transition of sort of essentially a journalist who becomes a historian, and what, if any, unique burdens come with that.
Yeah. Well, I worked for news magazines for a long time. I wrote for Time and Newsweek for 33 years. And every week I would write these Newsweek stories in this voice of the news magazines, and we always pretended that we knew what we were talking about, even when we didn't. And we adopted this kind of Olympian tone, and I became adept at writing that Olympian tone. I did over 100 cover stories at Newsweek. But I always wanted to have something that I could call my own, that could go back further, and I could take more time with. And history allows you to do that, to go deeper into the past. You're never going to get to the truth. In fact, probably never even close to the truth. But you can get closer. You can, if you, with enough time and enough sources and enough time passing, you can get closer, and I think I have in my books. Now, is it perfect? No. Will revisionists come along after me and come to utterly different conclusions? Yes. That's the nature of history, and it should be. We should be constantly revisiting history and questioning ourselves and challenging ourselves. I don't like it when people criticize me, but I sure accept it, and I've done plenty of criticism myself, so it's fair game. Do I get too close to my subjects? Yes, I think I probably do. Historians or writers have it's an occupational hazard, falling in love with the person you're writing about. I'm about to challenge this with Richard Nixon, actually. But with Nixon, I'm going to humanize him. I am. He's become a caricature in a cartoon. And that's not fair to Nixon, and that's not fair to history. There's a more complicated person there. I don't know Richard Nixon, and in the end, 3 years from now, I won't know him, but I'll have a better idea. And I'll bet you I find a more human person there. If you look hard enough, you find it.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that a writer like you, and I hope in myself, in my own ways, but that a journalistically oriented person perhaps is more likely to do, and that is to find the real human voice of a figure as enormous as an Eisenhower was, and I think that comes through very powerfully in the book. One other area that you make it very clear from the beginning that this is a book about his national security history, really, of Eisenhower as it relates to those matters, foreign affairs, and not really domestic policy history. Right. But there are some domestic issues you touch on, one of which is you spend a little time on Eisenhower's being AWOL, essentially. That's probably the nicest way to say it in regard to civil rights and African Americans. But what was happening there, and was he simply a man of his time, as my grandfather's racism was excused, but what really was going on with Eisenhower there?
You're right. This is mostly a book about foreign affairs and really about nuclear policy. But I do have a short section on civil rights because I think it's relevant to his leadership style. Eisenhower did not like to use the bully pulpit. He did not like to take great moral stands. He liked to operate behind the scenes. And something is gained and something is lost from that. He did miss a chance to take a kind of moral position and tell the country, we got to get with the program here on civil rights. But he did a lot more behind the scenes than was known at the time. And historians have come to realize this. For instance, although Truman signed the order to desegregate the armed services, the guy who actually did it was Eisenhower. Eisenhower desegregated the District of Columbia. Eisenhower was the real force between the first Civil Rights Act in 1957, although LBJ gets all the credit in Robert Caro's book. The guy who started that ball rolling was Eisenhower. Now, he did it all behind the scenes, but that's an administration bill. And it was actually weakened in the Senate by LBJ. Eisenhower appointed the federal judges who carried through Brown v. Board of Education. The Eisenhower administration was for the result in Brown v. Board of Education. They filed an amicus brief in favor of desegregation. When a governor of a state, Orville Faubus in Arkansas, defied a federal judge, Eisenhower, who was really an all-or-nothing guy, did not fool around. He sent in the 101st Airborne with bayonets drawn to enforce a federal order to desegregate Central High School in Arkansas. So he was not as outspoken as he might have been. He was, to some degree, a creature of his time. He had a lot of rich friends from the South. He played golf at Augusta. He did share some of the attitudes of his time and place. But he also believed in enforcing the law and carrying out his constitutional duties, and he did. And he believed in gradual change. He didn't think the South was ready for severe, immediate change, but he believed that change was coming and it had to happen, and he actually did a lot behind the scenes to make it happen.
Well, let me ask you one last question, and then let's have some questions from the audience. Another thing that journalists are willing to do in that Olympian voice you described a minute ago is to make pronouncements, or perhaps to see the connections between the present and the past a little more explicitly than classic historians are comfortable doing sometimes. But what are the lessons that one would draw from this? We live in a time in which dealing with the aftermath of war, dealing with bringing soldiers back home, many of the same extremely complex social and foreign policy issues that faced Eisenhower in a different context are on the table today. If this is a book that President Obama reads, what would you hope he would draw from it?
Several things. One on style of leadership, and the other on substance, on policy grounds. Just to do the second first, the policy part. Eisenhower makes a pretty good case for staying out of half wars. This idea that we can have limited wars, gradual escalation, surgical strikes, that we can kind of go halfway, I think we've learned through Vietnam and Iraq and other experiences, is a bad idea. You get into these wars, you think you can control them, and you can't. This was Eisenhower's central realization, perception, and I think that's a valuable lesson. And I think Obama, in a way, has heard it. I mean, he hasn't rushed into Syria. He's been getting us out of Afghanistan and Iraq. That already happened, really. So I think that I think that Obama has sort of at least half listened to that lesson. It's called a realist school in foreign policy. That's the one policy lesson. Another is that a sound national security comes from a sound economy. And Eisenhower was a balanced budget guy. And he realized that if you want to have a really sound country, you gotta, your expenditures and your revenues, they gotta roughly match. And that's a valuable lesson I think the politicians could take today. Now, it was easier in his day because you didn't have all that social spending that we do today. But Eisenhower was, in those days, 70% of the federal budget was defense spending. Today it's 20. Well, that's where the money was, so Eisenhower cut it by 20%. Even though the Cold War is going on and it's a lot of costs, he controlled it. Now, on the leadership thing, this was maybe the most important lesson. I think Eisenhower had this wonderful quality of the confidence to be humble. And if there was one thing I wish that President Obama could take from Dwight Eisenhower, it's that. I find Obama to be cocky sometimes and to be a little peevish sometimes and kind of, oh, woe is me, gee, I'm doing you this big favor by being president. I find that off-putting. And Eisenhower was not that way. Yes, it's a different age. Eisenhower's a 19th century Victorian. He was born in Kansas in 1890. I mean, long ago, different time. He didn't have to deal with C-SPAN and Morning Joe and, all that. So it was easier for him to be the modest appearing person that he was. He wasn't actually modest. He had a huge ego, but the modest appearing person that he was. So it's unfair to compare Eisenhower and Obama. Nonetheless, I do think that Obama, particularly as he deals with the other party, could be a little bit more humble and take a longer view of this. One more substance thought. Eisenhower invested in infrastructure, the interstate highway system. How did he pay for it? A gas tax. A gas tax. You don't hear politicians today, we couldn't do a carbon tax or a gas tax. We can't do that. Well, Eisenhower did. And he used the word sacrifice in his speeches. Politicians today won't use that word. There was a sort of a greater sense, seems to me, in the 50s that we're all in this thing together and we got to step up to the threats of the day, and if we have to sacrifice a little bit, well, we got to sacrifice.
I have to ask this, could he be a Republican today?
No.
Or could he be a Democrat today?
No, I mean, the Republican Party would drum him out. He was, this is sad, he was, moderate Republicans are, except for maybe the people in this room, are pretty extinct. There are pockets of them, but the party itself has moved, obviously, in a different direction. For one thing, I'm quite sure that Eisenhower would be willing to make a budget deal that would raise revenue, certainly at the high end. No question in my mind that he would do that. In Eisenhower's date, the maximum marginal tax rate was 90%. Again, because he felt this is left holdover from World War II, but we had to sacrifice to pay for the challenges of the day. So Eisenhower would be willing to take a deal that the modern Republican Party would not. And he'd be willing to make that deal by sitting down. Eisenhower spent a lot of time sitting with LBJ and Rayburn, with leaders from the other party, getting stuff done. He wouldn't have understood the partisanship of the day. He certainly wouldn't have liked it.
Talking about Eisenhower and his attitude towards the bomb and war, can you talk a little bit about covert action?
Sure.
Because he was the guy that was around for the sort of the glory days, if you want to call it that way, of covert action.
This is Fred Hitz, who was Inspector General of the Central Intelligence Agency and teaches intelligence here at the University of Virginia. I think one of the weakest sides of the Eisenhower performance was his handling of covert action. It takes some context. If you don't want to fight conventional wars with troops, and you don't want to fight a nuclear war, but you do want to stand up to communism, what's left? Covert action. that seemed like a good tool, cheap, efficient, and at first it seemed to be working. The CIA sponsored coups in Guatemala and Iran in 1953 and 1954, and today those operations look not so great. But at the time, it looked like we were getting something done relatively cheaply to check communist expansionism. Well, the CIA's record, which was initially successful on those coups, becomes less successful as time goes on. There are failed coups in Indonesia and Syria and various botched operations here and there. And Eisenhower, there's no real congressional oversight in those days, partly because Eisenhower didn't want to have Joe McCarthy overseeing the CIA, but Eisenhower used basically his friends to look over. Seasoned diplomats like Ambassador Bruce and Bob Lovett, this early incarnation of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. And those men, the wise men, warned Eisenhower that the CIA was getting a little out of control. They're trying to be kingmakers all over the world. And Eisenhower probably should have done a better job of reining that in. And he probably should have gotten rid of Allen Dulles, who was the charismatic and brilliant head of the CIA and kind of ran the CIA in its glory years, but was getting a little loose around the edges, certainly by the late 50s, and a little bit too in love with covert action. When Eisenhower's advisors would say, you need to do something about Dulles. And Eisenhower said, it takes a strange kind of genius to run intelligence agencies. And he was right about that. And it's hard to do this. I mean, intelligence, Fred would be the first to say, it's hard to do this. Intelligence, covert action is hard. It's a high risk. It has blowback. It often fails, which is why you have to do it carefully. But it's not easy to do. And Eisenhower had an appreciation that it's not easy, and he was willing to accept risk and some failure. World War II, he'd seen risk and failure and some success. And he was maybe a little too tolerant of this failure. He probably should have had a tighter leash on the agency.
Well, just to follow on to that very quickly, the implications of his allowing the CIA to go kind of rogue, to put it that way, could play out for some time and affect events well after he's president. In similar ways, he dallies with the French in Indochina, comes very close to a more, or at least considers a more serious engagement there, but also heightens the American interest in that, and arguably steps that begin to be a part of what is then Kennedy's war in Vietnam. What about
but with an important big difference. Eisenhower did not commit combat troops to Vietnam. He had the chance in 1954. The French wanted us to. There was a lot of debate about it. Eisenhower said the jungle will consume armies by divisions. And he did not put combat troops in there. And he was very uncomfortable with Kennedy and Johnson doing this gradual half war. Eisenhower said to these men, if you're going to do this, do it. Declare war. Go all the way. Bomb Hanoi. Or don't do it at all. And he was not a halfway guy, and I think he was right about that. History vindicates him on that. So, yes, the United States was committed to South Vietnam, but Eisenhower was pretty careful not to put combat troops in there.
Will you comment on Eisenhower's relationship with Nixon, and do you think anything about Eisenhower rubbed off on Nixon ultimately?
Yeah. Well, it was a fraught relationship. Eisenhower barely knew Nixon when he chose him to be vice president, really, as party chieftains did. They needed a bridge to the party's right wing, and Nixon was able to deliver the California delegates, which they needed at the 1952 convention. So it was a political choice. And then, right away, Nixon gets into trouble with this slush fund. It was unfair. It was a phony scandal. This slush fund was nothing. But Eisenhower kept Nixon twisting in the wind, didn't back him up, and Nixon had to give that famous checker speech that you may recall, slightly maudlin but very effective checker speech. And Eisenhower did not rally to Nixon's defense, and Nixon was deeply hurt by this, deeply wounded, was sort of intimidated by the great general. And Ike had that sunny, warm smile, but he could be cold-blooded. In fact, I was talking to John Eisenhower, Eisenhower's son, and I was talking about the balance between the genial Ike and the cold-blooded Ike, and I said 50-50, and John Eisenhower said, make that 75% cold-blooded. This is a son talking about his father. So Nixon felt the cold side. Now, Nixon was a good vice president for Eisenhower. He did his dirty work. Eisenhower wanted to float above the fray in campaigns. Nixon was the guy who had to go out and sling the mud with Eisenhower's tacit and sometimes explicit approval. And Nixon did that. Nixon did some tough work on civil rights, good work on civil rights. And Eisenhower never really supported him. There's a famous scene, which some of you know, 1960, Nixon was running for president to be Eisenhower's successor. And at a press conference, August 1960, Eisenhower was asked by a reporter, can you tell us something that Vice President Nixon did to promote U.S. foreign policy? And Eisenhower answers, if you give me a week, I'll think of something. Ouch. Now that was a blunder, and Ike regretted it, of course, and apologized, but the damage was done.
I'm kind of curious about this Nixon-Ike connection. I work with the Miller Center's Nixon recording program, and there's one tape that I listened to where in 1972, someone's just written an article about how Nixon didn't really do anything in the Ike White House, and Nixon is furious. He starts yelling at the guy for saying it. So I'm kind of curious what Nixon and Ike's relationship was like after, or in the 1960s, and then as Nixon was elected.
Well, there's a good book about this. Jeff Frank, I'm going to appear with Jeff actually tomorrow at the Charlottesville Book Festival. And always Nixon was seeking Eisenhower's approval. And Eisenhower gave it to him, and they actually became closer after 1960. I think at some level, Eisenhower kind of felt bad that he hadn't been nicer to Nixon, never invited him socially. Nixon was a very sensitive guy, and it hurt his feelings. And I think that Eisenhower sensed that. And I think he was always seeking the approval of Eisenhower, and Eisenhower wanted to give it. Frank has an interesting thesis that he advances at the very end of his book, that had Eisenhower lived, Eisenhower died in 1969, that Nixon might have been better behaved to please his mentor, Eisenhower, that he might have been a little bit more sensitive to the ethical niceties or a little bit more careful. Now, this is a guess, obviously, a complete guess, but it's an intriguing one. Makes you think. Certainly, you know, when Eisenhower died, Nixon wept copiously and wept real tears of what? Of sorrow, of frustration, of who knows. But it was an emotional thing for him.
I have a hard one. I like the idea that Ike did not want to go to war. How would Ike have reacted, you think, to the bombing of the World Trade Center on 9/11? Would he have declared war on Afghanistan or tried to do some covert action?
Well, of course, the correct answer is I have no idea. Now, having said that, my guess is that he would have gone hard after Afghanistan. I mean, he would have made damn sure with massive force that Osama was captured and killed. What he would have done beyond that, I don't think he would have gone into Iraq. It certainly violates his notions of doing these things, certainly not halfway. But he would have been very violent with Al-Qaeda, yes.
Thank you.
Having heard you a number of times before here at the Miller Center, it's great to have you back.
Thank you. It's always great. I've been here maybe half a dozen times, something like that, and I love coming here.
And what I wanted to ask you, I recently have seen an article in which you apparently were quoted as saying you've become more conservative in your older age.
I think that's true.
Not the old age, but older age.
I've gone from being a kind of conventional liberal college kid in the early 70s to sort of a conventional liberal reporter to, I would say, my politics now are in the mushy middle. and kind of fickle and unpredictable. I am a little reactive, and I'm a deficit hawk. Big deficit hawk. I think that's our big issue, and I really care about that. I've become more conservative on foreign policy. I would say I put myself in what they call the realist school. I don't know how realist it is, but non-interventionist unless there's a real national interest in doing it. Beyond that, you're in Washington for a long time. The effect on me was to make me less political. The more I hung around politicians and was in the political world, the less political I became.
Eisenhower was someone that the Democrats wanted to draft in 1948 and then obviously ran as a Republican at a time when the dominant figure in the Republican Party was highly isolationist, Senator Taft.
Right.
So I guess I was just wondering if you could comment on why you think, for a man who had really had no at least visible partisan identity prior to his presidential bid, why he chose to run as a Republican.
Right. It was not known for a long time what he was, and he liked to keep people guessing. Eisenhower was definitely a guy who enjoyed keeping people guessing about all things. Fascinating, in 1945, I think it was, President Truman says to General Eisenhower that if you run on the Democratic ticket, on the top of the ticket for president in 1948, I'll run as vice president. Now think about that. The President of the United States volunteered to take a demotion if Eisenhower would run on the top of the ticket. And I think he did it a couple of times. Truman changed his mind about Eisenhower because the 1952 elections don't make for friends. Elections never do. Eisenhower, I think, was always basically a Republican. He was a small-town Kansas boy with fairly conservative small-town belief in small-town virtues and not a great believer in big government, but importantly, did believe in preserving the New Deal. I mean, the Republicans in 1952, a lot of them wanted to just get rid of the New Deal. And Eisenhower understood we're way past that. The New Deal played an important role. We have to take care of the old and the sick, and he got that. And he was in opposition to his own party, or at least to what was known as the old guard of his own party. He was also an internationalist. And as you mentioned, Senator Taft was essentially an isolationist. And a lot of the Republican Party was isolationist, and Eisenhower was an internationalist. His natural comrades were in the Council on Foreign Relations and kind of liberal Democrats of that era. Bob Lovett, Harriman, those folks were much closer to Eisenhower than Bob Taft was. So he was a liberal internationalist, conservative on fiscal policy, balanced budget guy. What does that make him today? Something that's unfortunately extinct, a moderate Republican. Bring him back.
You alluded earlier to the fact that he played so many rounds of golf during his presidency. And one, how did this help him do his job? And what was the public reaction to him playing so much golf at the time in the 50s?
He was criticized. I mean, presidents had more privacy in the 50s, yes. But even in the 50s, they noticed how much golf he was playing. And he was criticized about it and teased about it. And it added to the image of him being a little clueless and a little out of it and a bit of a caretaker. He was unapologetic about it. He has basically said, well, I should play more golf. Now, why? How did he rationalize it? He was somebody who dealt with intense stress for decades. On the night he became president, he wrote in his diary, well, big challenges and problems ahead, but you know, in a way it's not new. It's like what I've been doing since 1941. After all, he had sent thousands of men into battle, knowing many of them would not come back. He had ordered the bombing of cities. He had had enormous responsibility, so he was accustomed to it, and he knew from painful experience that stress is a killer. He had smoked 4 packs of cigarettes a day in World War II. He quit cold turkey in 1949. He said, I gave myself an order to quit. And he felt he had to relax, and the way he wanted to relax was playing golf. Now, any golfers out here? Golfing is not necessarily the most relaxing game. certainly for a perfectionist. And reading his doctor's diary, his doctor, Howard Snyder, was a loyal, faithful doctor. There was an entry in there that made me sit up. They're playing golf, and Howard Snyder, Ike muffs a shot out of a bunker, and Howard Snyder, trying to be encouraging, says, "Nice shot." Eisenhower threw his golf club at his doctor, his sand wedge, and it wrapped around his leg and almost broke his leg. That's a pretty severe reaction, even for golfers with bad tempers. I got a pretty bad temper as a golfer, but I hope I never throw my club at somebody. You know, so he was, and I'm read and have been told that he was kind of a grim golfer. He wasn't a lot of laughs out there, but it was a deflection and a diversion. He loved doing it. He would put his golf shoes on, and in fact, he left. When LBJ came in, found holes in the floor of the Oval Office from Ike's golf spikes. I think Nixon had it refloored. He had a putting green out behind by the Rose Garden there. He'd take his beloved 8-iron out and hit golf balls out on the ellipse and have his valet, as Sergeant Money, pick up the golf balls. If you were a tourist, you could watch the president out there, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, hitting shots. So he played a lot of golf. Yeah.
Hello. The Miller Center on its website has an intriguing phone conversation between President Kennedy and former President Eisenhower during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the relationship between those two men.
Yeah. I mean, as I recall, that conversation is basically bucking up Kennedy and telling him that the Russians are not going to do anything terrible here, trying to give confidence to him. And he played a kind of a avuncular role with Kennedy. At first, Eisenhower was dismissive of Kennedy, he referred to him as that whippersnapper, and was disgusted in the Bay of Pigs when Kennedy carried through a kind of a half-baked plan. As you recall, the Bay of Pigs was a Cuban invasion Cuban exile invasion of Cuba backed by the CIA. It was a disaster. The Cubans were driven into the sea in a couple of days, most of them killed or captured. And President Kennedy woke up that morning, according to his wife, Jacqueline, in tears, just appalled by what had happened. And he called Eisenhower that morning. And I met Eisenhower at Camp David. And Eisenhower began to grill President Kennedy on the planning for the Bay of Pigs, because Eisenhower had a very formal planning process at the White House. He believed that the military often do. You got to have a lot of plans. In fact, Eisenhower liked to quote the elder von Moltke that plans are nothing but planning is everything. You know, the notion is that first contact with the enemy, plans go out the window, but you still got to plan. And Kennedy had gotten rid of all that planning structure because he had all these smart guys from Harvard and Yale with him, and who needs plans? If you've got Mac Bundy, who needs plans? Well, they got themselves into a big mess. And so Ike walked Kennedy through how he'd done this, and things like Kennedy had talked to a lot of people one-on-one, but not in a larger group where he could see the cross currents and see the different groups bouncing off of each other. So disastrously, President Kennedy asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff, do you approve of the Bay of Pigs? And they said yes. What they meant was not that we think this will work. What they meant was it's a CIA plan. It's not our responsibility. And Kennedy couldn't kind of hear the secret dog whistle that generals put out when they don't really mean what they say. So after this kind of morning tutorial at the end of it, Kennedy said, I get it. And he started putting in a much better planning process to oversee covert actions and so forth, and brought in Maxwell Taylor. And it wasn't exactly the Eisenhower structure, but it was a lot more structure than Kennedy had. So I think Kennedy learned from Ike. And fortunately, by the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is October 1962, I think Kennedy really has grown in office. I've listened to the tapes of the XCOM. About half of those, XCOM was the group that advised President Kennedy during the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And you listen to those tapes, and on the last day, which was, I guess, really the 12th day, President Kennedy's great. He's the smart. He's fantastic. He's a solid, steady, cool hand. And the others are starting to get a little tense. In fact, I was amused by this as such a comment on that generation. This is a group of middle-aged white males trying not to sound scared. And their voices are very kind of even and well, we might have to evacuate the southeastern United States. And you know, they're all very calm and steady until the last day. And then the voices start getting a little ragged. And I remember McNamara, McNamara's so, in control, he's kind of ragged on that last day. The guy who sounds cool is the president. It's really kind of like a Hollywood movie. The good guy, the smart guy, the calm guy, the steady guy is the president of the United States, thank God. And he is cooking up this deal that got us out of it, saving face by trading the missiles, and they got us out of this jam. And you can argue about maybe they shouldn't have gotten us in this jam, but they did get us out. And Kennedy sounds pretty good, and I like to think he learned something from President Eisenhower along the way.
Evan, it's interesting that you bring that up because in October we had a program here on the 50th anniversary of Kennedy's speech around the missile crisis, and one of the scholars who participated in that was someone who's done a lot of new work on the newly learned reality in Moscow of what the Russians were really saying to each other. And what their real motivations were. And we played that recording of Kennedy talking to Eisenhower, and it turns out that Eisenhower was the one person in the whole sequence who had it right, and that in fact the Russians really were bluffing, and Kennedy and all of his guys had the motivations wrong. Though notably, what also came through was that Kennedy surrounded himself with these guys with somewhat disparate views, and in the end took a course of action that played out. So it's fascinating, though, that Eisenhower read the Soviets better than anybody who was in the White House at the time.
I think also, I wasn't there at the conference, so I don't know what was said, but the dynamics here, former President Eisenhower is trying to give courage and resolve to President Kennedy. And President Kennedy, he is in the position of responsibility. He has to make some worst-case assumptions. He can't really be blasé about the
end of humanity.
Right. He's sort of got to take the worst case. And all planners, everybody of you who studied this, planners always, and correctly, plan for the worst. And so you're apt to, it's sort of the planner's dummy, you tend to take worst case assumptions.
Yeah, earlier you acknowledged the criticism that as President Eisenhower kind of waited until the end to deliver his warning about the military-industrial complex and didn't kind of act to counter that climate of paranoia that led us to build that tremendous overkill of nuclear weapons. But I'm left wondering if you're kind of letting him off a little easy there, because in President Eisenhower, you had a man with just impeccable credentials, the former Supreme Allied Commander. You'd think that if anyone were capable of standing up to Senator Joe McCarthy or kind of confronting the vested interests, that he could have done it were he more engaged. I mean, say what you will about Richard Nixon, but he did not learn how to go to China from President Eisenhower, is the feeling I'm left with. Do you think that's a fair criticism?
Partly. On McCarthy, Eisenhower embarrassed himself in 1952 by cutting out of a speech some sentences that defended General Marshall, the sainted General Marshall, the organizer of victory, from attack by McCarthy. And Eisenhower took those sentences out of political advice because he was in the state of Wisconsin and McCarthy's own state, and he was running for president. And it was a kind of a low moment, expedient moment for Ike. And a lot of Ike's staff was furious about this and said, you got to stand up to McCarthy. But Eisenhower did it his own way. He said, I'm not getting into a pissing contest with a skunk. I'm not getting down in the gutter with that guy. I'm not going to dignify him by getting into a big fight that's just going to split our own party apart. And he knew that McCarthy was going to hang himself, and McCarthy did. It took about 15 months, but Ike, working behind the scenes, did a lot to undermine McCarthy, particularly at the end, actually by invoking executive privilege and sort of draining McCarthy of his ammunition in the Army McCarthy hearings. And so there's a book being written about this now by a guy named Dave Nichols. Eisenhower actually did a lot quietly to undermine McCarthy and bring him to an end. Now, maybe he should have morally postured, but as I was saying earlier about civil rights, that really was not Ike's style. On the on the nuclear point, yes, the nuclear stockpile got too big. But Eisenhower was constantly fighting with the Joint Chiefs. The record, the behind-the-scenes record, is one of him reining in the Joint Chiefs, who wanted to use nuclear weapons 6 times in 1954 in various debates and disputes, and Eisenhower said no, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Radford, who was constantly urging it. So Eisenhower was able to check his own military. He infuriated the Army Chief of Staff, General Ridgway, his own comrade in arms from World War II, by cutting the Army, by refusing to get us in these small wars. So he was actively engaged in restraining the military on his own watch, not in public, but behind the scenes. He would say, I know those boys down at the Pentagon. I know how they hype the threat. In his first 2 weeks in office, the Air Force said, we got to have, I think it was 85 air wings, the communists are going to win. And Eisenhower said, no, you don't. You know, that's just an arbitrary number you pulled out of a hat. And so he cut defense spending. He should have done more on nuclear weapons. That's true. But he was more active than we realized in other roles. And this idea that Eisenhower let the Cold War get out of control and hype the threat, that's just not true. There were people hyping it for sure, the missile gap and all that, but Eisenhower was working against that, often behind the scenes, but actually working to control that.
Evan, thanks for being here.
Andrew.
Your last book prior to this was called The War Lovers, about Roosevelt and Hearst. This book is about someone who's quite averse to war. Any common character traits between these two great leaders, great egos?
Yeah. I mean, superficially, they're quite different because, actually, one reason why I wrote this book was because I just finished writing a book about Teddy Roosevelt and his desire to get into war. Eisenhower was a hot-to-fight young politician who left his job as Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the age of 40 when he had a family to join the Rough Riders. All of his friends thought he was nuts. And he said, I just got to do this. I just have got to fight. I've got to test myself in this way. And there are a lot of psycho theories about whether it was to make up for his father not fighting in the Civil War. But he just, for whatever reason, was absolutely determined to fight. And he did fight, and bravely for a day or two. Eisenhower was a commander who never was in combat himself, but who ran large armies, by the end 100 divisions, you know, the bombing of cities, and had to make moral choices that Roosevelt never even had to consider. One that comes to mind. So it shows you the weight of command. In August 1944, General Toohey Spatz, who's the Air Force commander in Europe, writes Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower, a letter saying the British want us to join them in bombing cities at night bombing civilians. The Americans were bombing military targets by day, but the British want us to come in with them. I don't want to do it, he says, because this war is going to end. There are going to be war crimes and war criminals, and I don't want to be a war criminal. And Eisenhower writes back a very short letter that says, one question, will it end the war more quickly? And the answer was yes. And we joined the British in bombing. We were on the Dresden raid, and we didn't do a ton of it, but we did some of it. So the point here is Eisenhower, you wonder why Eisenhower was smoking 4 packs of cigarettes a day and couldn't sleep at night. He's lying in bed asking himself pretty basic questions like, I don't want to be a war criminal either. I don't want to bomb civilians, but will it end the war faster? And if the answer is yes, what's the moral obligation? The moral obligation was to say, yes, we're going to do it. Now, that's a pretty tough burden for any human to bear. Eisenhower had to bear it because he had the authority. He just had to face that kind of decision. Teddy Roosevelt was a much more personal thing. He just wanted to show his own valor. He wasn't making decisions about bombing cities. He was just trying to show that he, Teddy Roosevelt, was brave enough to ride a horse up a hill with people shooting at him. Different things.
Evan, would Eisenhower's bluff, would his penchant for ambiguity and a certain amount of secrecy, could all that have survived in the modern, current media environment?
Boy, it makes you wonder. I mean, this is a little bit aside from your question, but just think about the Cuban Missile Crisis. 13 days, secret committee meeting trying to figure out what to do. That secret would have lasted about an hour and a half today with C-SPAN, CNN, and all that.
These constant questions about what a timeline for withdrawal from Afghanistan or from Iraq, and the accusations about this necessity of political figures to take a position.
The daily beast that requires instantaneous decision-making and airing all this stuff. Now, there are still secrets, fortunately. Reporters can be lazy, and they don't always inquire. And you know, I think it is possible to argue the other way here for a second, that the mainstream press has gotten less aggressive as their resources have diminished. And we weren't all that aggressive in the wind-up to the Iraq War. After 9/11, we were all kind of on our heels, and I include myself, Newsweek, and we're not asking the questions that we should have. So the modern press is not always in the know. We miss things. See, it is possible to keep secrets out of the laziness of the press, but your basic question is to the point. And it's a more open media environment. It's harder to hold secrets. It would have been tougher for Eisenhower to operate in his secretive way. That's a little bit worrisome when you think about it. There are bad things about the government being so secretive in the 1950s. A lot of bad things. J. Edgar Hoover being one of them. And a lot of what the CIA did, frankly. But there were good things about it. You know, big, great powers have to be able to keep secrets, because sometimes they can't divulge secrets. And it's a very tough, and open societies really struggle with this. You know, Fred Hitz, who's sitting here, has a lot of experience with this. How do you strike that balance between the need for secrecy and openness? Very hard to get that right. I've been personally on all sides of this debate at various times, depending on the situation and what I think about it. Very hard to get that right.
But Eisenhower did.
Mostly, not entirely, mostly.
Thank you very much.
All right, let's scooch you out.